Hello there. It's a philosophy Saturday today. It's actually a Sunday in the real world, but this will be going out on Philosophy Saturday, and I have the pleasure of having another philosopher with me, Miss Doctor. Is it? I
It
assume
is.
Doctor
It
Brennan.
is.
Is it Lavor? Lavois? Lav-
We put Larvor. It's actually from Brittany, and none of us speaks Breton, so we don't know.
you don't know how to say your own name.
Yeah, yeah,
Brilliant. That is very philosophical there. Straight off.
yeah. So you can call me what you. Hey you. I answer to hey you.
Hey, you right? So Brendan, you brilliantly pushed back on the video I had, which was a conversation with Dr. John Phillips, where he attempted in about an hour to cover the whole history of philosophy and how it relates to art and music, which I think he did a reasonable job. And I was really chuffed that you, who know your stuff as well, also felt he did a really good job, and I think he did. And you pushed back a little bit on my sort of Hegelian view of history, even though underlying it, I was trying to push back against Hegel. Now, the musicians watching this will not know what we're talking about there, and I hope by watching our conversation, they will start to see that these things do have an influence on art and music, and there's all these ideas flowing around. But you're also a musician, aren't you?
Well, I'm a middle-aged man with a guitar. I still have all of the rejection letters from when my college band sent its demo to the record companies in 1988. And my plan is when I've got a bigger room that can be my music studio, I'm going to frame those rejection letters and have them on the wall in the place where the gold discs would have gone. uh, yeah, I mean, I listened to that demo a few years later. They were right. No, but yeah, I play a bit like everybody else.
So, from a philosophical point of view, do you want to just give us a very quick description of your expertise in that area?
Yeah, sure. My core expertise is in philosophy of maths, but Um, when I was a student, I got interested in a particular philosopher of maths called Imre Lakatos. Here he is pictured on the cover of a very affordable book, 5 stars on Amazon. Please don't ruin that for me, please. But anyway, uh, but he has this dialectical view of mathematics, very Hungarian, very Central European. Um, and to understand that, I had to learn about what dialectics is, which meant, amongst other things, I had to learn about Hegel. And I ended up designing and teaching a module on Hegel, so I got quite into it. But also, he wrote about philosophy of science as well. Now, the big news in philosophy of science was Thomas Kuhn, 1962, uh, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and that is another work of philosophy that looks at history and divides it into epochs. Um, if you're familiar with, you've heard the word paradigm, anybody who talks about changing the paradigm, they owe it to Kuhn, right? So he has this picture where scientists all have the same way of going about their business, and that's stable. And then there's a crisis and a revolution, and it restabilizes. So it's kind of punctuated in equilibrium thing. And that made a big change to the way people did philosophy of science, and it meant that philosophers of science had to think about the history of science. And as a result, there are now departments of the history and philosophy of science. So me coming along as a doctoral student in the early 90s, that all happened. So Kuhn's book was in the 60s, thousands of papers written by philosophers through the 70s and 80s about why his whole view was rubbish. And then finally, a kind of actually this is quite serious. You need to engage with this. So I come along in the 90s trying to understand this. And the point for us is that that was an encounter between history as written and understood by historians and history as written and understood by philosophers who like to look at the past, who draw on history in order to do philosophy. And one of the things that's become apparent to me, partly by looking at that history and the history of science, philosophy of science, but also the way philosophy and mathematics has developed, is that historians think about these things in quite different ways from philosophers who try to use history. And one of the differences, the difference that's important for us now, today, is that historians know that periodization isn't real, right? Historians know that you have to, or at least it's not deep. Historians know that you have to carve up the past in order to be able to write about it at all. But your choices about how you carve it up are largely a matter of what kind of historian you are and what you care about and what your politics is and so on. So I taught myself some philosophy of history. I thought I've got to get serious about this, right? So the more you get into how historians think about historiography, the more kind of embarrassing this reification of periodization that you find in the philosophers is. So that's kind of our thing for today.
So this
Yeah, go
is
ahead.
very interesting for me because I have certain. I'm not a fan of ideology or dogma. I am, my mom and dad were both scientists. So I was brought up with that sort of view of the world. And then in doing music, I've also got a very aesthetic view of the world. And my whole life, I've been trying to bring those two things together, and I've had the realization that art sort of does that. That's what you're trying to do when you do art. Is there's a dialectic there, and I'm sure you've seen me go on about this for a long time. But what you've made me aware of is that I may have a little bit of a dogma going on in carving up art and music history into these epochs. So I would say that this is how I see it, and then you can start shooting it down. I see it that from around about 1962 onwards, we went into a sort of postmodernist era, which impinged on the arts in a certain way. It actually happened to the arts first, and then moved into the academy, by the 70s and 80s. And I feel that we're at a point now where those ideas have atrophied. They were very useful at a certain point in time, but they've atrophied. And now we're suffering from that. Before that, there was a modernist era. And the modernist era runs down to around about 1912, 1907, with Picasso and Stravinsky. I'm an arty type, so I tend to think like that. And then before the modernist era, then we have, I suppose, we would have like the romantic era that is there, that lasts for the whole of the 19th century. Then we go to the Enlightenment, it's like a few hundred years. Then we've got the Renaissance, it's even longer. Then we've got the Dark Ages that takes us. And so the point you made out is that the further it goes away, the bigger these things become. But also, which is far more important to me, is these things, if they do exist at all, are local to certain cultural positions. Subjectively, I sit in a certain place in the West as a white middle-aged man, blah blah blah, so I'll tend to see the world in a certain way. And one of the things that I found very interesting is because I've also pushed back on my channel about the ownership of jazz. Who owns music? Who can play it? Who can't play it? Does it have messages that sort of embody sort of identity politics or not, or were we finding those? And so again, I'm pushing back against that view of history, but in the same time engaging in another view of history. So how do you feel about this idea of ownership? Where do you think that comes from, and why that has become a very important argument culturally in terms of all the art forms that are out there?
Well, before we get to ownership, can I just kind of do a bit with the previous bit about the periodization?
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Okay.
you're. I think local is right. You get developments in some area of life, whether it's maths or art or
Yeah,
architecture or whatever, and a generation reacts to the previous generation. But you get generations, you get groups of people who form a movement because there's an institution that gathers them together, right? And then they become a thing, and they eventually becomes kind of tired and boring, and the younger people come along and go, that's tired and boring. So within particular bits of life and in particular localities, yes, you can tell these kind of dialectical stories, and they're not necessarily illegitimate. They might actually be insightful. They might actually, help you to understand what's going on. Especially if the people are self-consciously reacting, right? You can't, if they all say, "Well, we're reacting to that thing," you can't. Oh, fair. You know, it's the bit where you say, "Well, um, and of course, this was also happening."
So your objection is shoehorning. Once you've seen it's there, you gaze upon it with subjective eyes and try and shoehorn other ideas. And one of the things that upset me is that you said that we were seeing certain scientific discoveries, like say
yeah,
Einstein's relativity at one end, quantum physics, and I've got to tell you, I am totally. I believe that science is the pursuit of truth, which is an ongoing thing, and it is not influenced. Well, it should not be influenced by culture. If it ever does become influenced by culture, then it's not science. So, what I think we were trying to say is those discoveries at that point actually affected culture in a certain way. I think that's a
yeah. I'm pleased to have given you an opportunity to clarify that. I did watch your video with John again yesterday, and actually, I think we can. He who is absent is in the wrong, right? I think we can blame John for this because you were talking about he was talking about Gödel and stuff. And to be fair, he was only talking about Gödel because you asked him to explain analytic philosophy in 2 minutes.
yeah.
So he probably wouldn't have gone there unless you pushed him. But
Well,
then
I
you
don't know what
said,
I'm talking about. You got to understand, I'm a drummer. I'm here.
yeah, yeah.
I do these interviews just to learn, and that's it. So I'm coming in all clunky, asking people. I mean, if you start talking to me about drumming, the tables will turn. But
Yeah, that's not
this
going to
way round,
happen.
it's
That's not going to happen. Do you see? I've brought me Adam Neely T-shirt
yes,
because we are the sons of Neely and Beato, right?
yes, yes.
Anyway, yes, where was I? Yes. So anyway, so you start talking about quantum mechanics, and John kind of leans into the camera and says they all coincide with an air of suggesting that it's more than a coincidence. And I'm watching this thinking, well, if you're going to do that, you better tell me what causes what,
Mm.
you know. And that was all rather that was a rather ambiguous moment. So but it's good that we're
No,
of
no,
a
I know
mind.
John will see this, and I'm sure he'll give me a message, and I'm sure the whole point. My big thing at the moment is people having conversations, friendly conversations, and trying to move towards something which is rational and beautiful at the same time. Because for me, the idea of the dialectic, which really goes back to sort of Aristotle, and even before then, it goes into sort of religious it is this idea of I hate to say chaos and order because I think that is an aspect. I don't think you can actually say what it is. But my idea is that the way we have evolved as human beings is we have evolved two different um, comprehensions of the world around us. One's sort of time based, although that doesn't describe it fully, and one is space based, and that doesn't describe it fully. And I think one of the interesting things with mathematics for me is that seems to reduce down to sort of zero and ones, and you have a dialectic in there. I can see you pulling your face there, and so then if I carry on, yeah, you come in there. So
Well, I'm not keen on things being reduced, really. So one of the things that I've written about that I've tried to understand is is how mathematics works. Now, the stuff that John was talking about, so he talked about Russell and Gödel and that whole foundational stuff um, from 100 years ago. One of the kind of structuring features of all that is the idea that you can reduce mathematics to set theory, right? That you can explain what space is in terms of kind of algebra and numbers and stuff, and then with apologies to my colleagues, but and then once you've got numbers, you can explain how the numbers work in terms of sets. And so the philosophical project of understanding mathematics reduces to questions about set theory. And this has a certain efficiency to it, but it means that you've lost sight of most of what most mathematicians do, right? Mathematicians are able to do what they do because of all sorts of kind of cognitive technologies. So one of the things about mathematical notations is that they invite manipulation. You can change them. They're not like ordinary writing. I mean, sure, you can word process, but the syntax of mathematical notation invites you to move the bits about. You can gather terms or multiply them out or whatever and so on. And also mathematicians are very good at spatializing non-spatial questions, right? And there are particular forms of argument, particular forms of mathematical thinking that are specific to different branches of mathematics. So knot theory, for example, they've got a particular way of using diagrams that you don't really find elsewhere in mathematics that's philosophically important because it's part of the epistemology of that bit of mathematics. So the kind of philosophical movement in philosophy of maths that I've been part of, that we all look to Lakatos for, he's the kind of the father Abraham of this stuff. Much of the point of that is to resist reducing mathematics down to set theory or ones and zeros or some other minimal collection. And if you just pay attention to that reduced bit, then you'll miss the texture and the nuances of most of the activity. It's a bit like if you think you can understand music by looking at scores, right? I mean, there's a certain point of view, and you can learn a lot, and there's a certain point of view, but there's a lot that you would just that you would be blind to or deaf to if you just paid attention to scores. And there are some.
But why is that? What would you be? I mean, you literally said it. What would you be deaf to? Deaf to?
Oh, if you try to understand music by just looking at scores, well, all the stuff that the score doesn't capture. So I've got a theory about why classical musicians do well on Strictly. And it's because classical musicians, every musician understands phrasing intuitively, but classical musicians study it explicitly and rigorously and have words for it.
Yeah,
right?
somebody else's phrasing, in effect, not their
Yeah,
own.
yeah, but there are some phrasing marks on the score, but really to do it properly, or if swing, right? All right, I'm gonna do exactly what I said I wouldn't do. Talk to a drummer about rhythm, right? I mean, you can indicate that swing is required on a score, but what you can't do is tell somebody how to do it on the score.
Well, I'm going to try and come in from my musician point of view and
Yeah.
see where I've arrived at, because I think that this could be the most important bit of this conversation if we can
All
get.
right. Okay.
And
It's
I
also the bit where I'm most lost. So let's.
Well, it's not because it comes down to what numbers are, which is
Okay.
something that I've given a great deal of thought, not because I'm a philosopher of mathematical history, but because I'm a drummer and I deal with them all day long. So you're dealing with numbers, you're marking time. So you realize that numbers have something to do with time. And numbers have something to do with physical movements. They are almost like related to our consciousness moving from one point to another within time and space. So the number pulls those two things together. So a number is literally you going 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's that there is the closest I can explain what a number is. And then within music, we have two aspects: a horizontal and a vertical. And the harmony again is numbered. It's an octave sounds harmonious because it is
It's the
beating
double.
frequency double to something that
Yeah.
50s like a 3/4 polyrhythm and all this type of stuff. So you suddenly realize it's all to do with ratios and numbers, and then you look at the history of humanity and you go back right to the beginnings of at least Western thought with Pythagoras, and you see this at the beginning of philosophy almost the coming together of these two ideas, which you could call the aesthetic and the rational. I don't know if that's the best way of describing it. They're together at the beginning of human sort of philosophical Western theory, but it's also there in Indian classical music at the beginning there, this idea that these things are together. And then as our civilization develops, we split them into two halves. So one of the things I found very interesting was the Pythagoreans when they were studying the ratios contained within harmonic scales, which exist in nature. They're not a man-made thing. They felt that you should not enjoy them. So they would not have polyphony because they thought, well, they knew it was there, but they didn't want to go down that route because this was a way of analyzing the world around them. And you could see like Western music as almost the move from that to just a pure individualistic joy of a major chord, and then this idea that the harmony gets more complex as music develops. Well, that's not because they got clever; it's because things changed, and we saw that richness as being, you go into the Romantic period. I'm doing it again now, aren't I?
Yeah.
but yeah. So, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing because I think what it does is, I think you're right. It makes me step back and think generally in terms of you know. In terms of, but I won't get bogged down in that. How do you feel like that? That numbers are basically they are related to us existing in the world, and they're to do as much cognitively. They're to do as much with movement and being as they are to do with thought. And the fact that we can build what we have on that is quite it's quite awe-inspiring.
It is. It is absolutely. I mean, we can count immaterial things, right? We can count. How many different kinds of infinity are there?
There's an infinite amount, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a joke. There's only three important numbers in mathematics: 0, 1, and infinity, right? But yeah, there are infinitely many kinds of infinity. And we can count infinite sets. We can compare infinite sets and so on. So you don't want to say that numbers are, in some logical sense, essentially related to materiality or consciousness or anything, um, because that would make a mystery of how there can be numbers of things that are neither material nor related to us. Right? There's a number of stars in the galaxy, but that's there already were before we arrived. But
Do you not think that do you think numbers exist in the universe, or are they a man-made creation? These are all the worst philosophical questions you can ask anybody.
Well, the answer to the question, how many stars are there in the galaxy, is not down to us. That's out there. That's objective. That's the kind of thing your parents would discover the truth of.
Mm.
Um, but there aren't things called numbers sitting there in some sort of platonic heaven.
That's true.
Um,
Agree with that totally.
yeah, and we only get going with counting because we are creatures of a certain sort.
I would agree.
Um, yeah. Uh, Now, exactly how that story goes. So, I mean, Kant had a view not a million miles away from what sounds like yours about mathematics. Do you know about this?
No,
You've heard
totally.
about?
No.
Okay, all right. Um, so Kant thought that we have what he called pure intuitions of space and time. So your pure intuition of time is like a kind of awareness of the bare structure of time. So it's not awareness of time passing. It's just it's kind of like an imaginary thread, something like that, right? It's an awareness of the one dimensional. And he had a similar thing for space. He thought, I mean, bad news. Einstein was bad news for Kantians because Kant thought that we had Newtonian
Yeah.
space programmed in, right? But this story is part of Kant's account of how we can know mathematics. Is that well, you get your understanding of number out of your pure intuition of time, and you get your understanding of geometry out of your pure intuition of space. Um, for kind of Einstein-y reasons, um, that didn't last. But there are kind of more recent ideas. There was a logician and mathematician and philosopher called Brouwer, who talked about the bare one-two-ness of things. And he had in mind the fact that your experience divides into the past and the future. So just by being somebody who's aware of the passage of time, you already get 1, 2. You get, the past and the future for free, and that is enough to get you going.
But what's the zero?
Oh well, it takes a while to get. It takes a while to get to zero. You need some framework in order to
Well, I would have
notice an
thought.
absence.
I would have thought, which is closer to my worldview, and I'll get onto how I rationalise my worldview. But I would have thought that the past was -1 and the future was +1, and our presence in the now, mindful. That's where we all want to be because it's the lovely place of bliss. It's the zero. It's space. It's being in a non-time based space. Now, um, I I went through a period of really being an out and out analytical philosophical viewpoint of the world, like a materialist, like a very scientific view. And then I started to think, well, what am I doing when you're creating art? What are you trying to do, and what's all this about? I linked art to. I saw that as being the outer coating of ethics and morality. That human beings have to do the job of deciding what's good and bad, as well as what's true and false. They're the two things that we have to do. And I felt that aesthetics basically us communicating to each other that we thought something was nice or not nice, and that our ethics and morality come from that. So I started to think there's an aesthetic way of viewing the world. And so when somebody loves, say when they say they're a pagan, for example, and they love all pagan stuff, I love all pagan stuff, and you got little wood elves and will o' the wisps and all that type of thing. Their view of the world, and this is a little bit postmodern, I suppose, but their view of the world is aesthetic, and within the aesthetic realm of good and bad, it's a thing. It's a sort of this is like a phenomenological view of truth. My problem with phenomenology was when it starts to impinge on material reality. Okay, now
Yeah.
I thought, well, where does this come from? If it hasn't just come from like this Kantian intuitive view, it's evolved, and it's evolved from creatures reaching out for pleasure and then getting bashed back. And so we as human as creatures, as things, are continually grasping out into space and then going, oh, I don't know whether I should do that, or I might have that. Oh no. And from that is where this dialectic comes from. And it's so rooted in us as human beings that we see the world through that lens. And so mathematics is affected by it's a way of us seeing the world.
Well,
I
it
don't
starts.
think it's actually there in reality. It's our
Yeah, it starts out that way. The thing about mathematics is it's essentially inscribed, right? You can do mental arithmetic, but to do anything worthy of the name of mathematics, you have to start making marks, which means that it is culturally relatively late. There's already layers of culture and theory and ideology built up in the human organism
yeah.
before that person starts doing mathematics. There's some discussion of Heidegger in your chat with John. I always feel that people who talk about Heidegger are insufficiently troubled by him being a Nazi. I wish people who talked about Nazi.
I spent a long time with my limited knowledge of philosophy of having a great dislike of Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, the critical theorists, the Frankfurt School, Foucault, all that type of stuff. And as I'm getting now, that's now my position. I don't like him, so I really don't like Heidegger, and I don't like his version of phenomenology because I believe it tries to make a truth out of just subjective experience, which undermines scientific truth and will get us in a right pickle. Especially the mathematicians would get us in a right pickle if we went down that way of thinking. But now at this point, and I have this other view. It's like Marcuse. I was reading him this morning before we came on, and now I would have said I hate him as a philosopher. He's the root of all the trouble. But within what he's saying, there was something that blew me away, and it was almost that right at the heart of what he was saying was it's almost like a criticism of what he has begat in colleges, which is there is a totality of thought, and it doesn't allow
Yeah.
you to
Oh,
think
yeah.
outside. And I thought, my God, that is a powerful thing. It's
Yeah. These guys are canonical for a reason.
yeah.
I'm not saying you shouldn't read Heidegger. I'm saying that as you read him and you feel tempted to adopt something that you find in him, do just
Yeah,
hold it up and go, is any of his fascism attached to that before you?
I agree completely. And there's those outside that who will be. I know people who are doing PhDs and they are using certain academic frameworks in the humanities, in the arts, in the music. I'm really suspect of this, that will be using ideas that go back to Heidegger. I mean, in the humanities, phenomenology is something that is the justification for all sorts of terrible things. So my point is, I'm not a fan of Heidegger in the limited knowledge that I have of him, but I don't want to throw him out. That's basically my point. And I feel like that with every philosopher now, even Foucault and all the ones I used to hate. I'm starting to go, yeah, none of them are doing what the academy almost takes them. This is on the art side. This is what I'm fighting against. I believe that we need to divide and say that's aesthetics. When you said about mathematics, you said it's best not to go to that point because there's a lot of stuff going on above it. I feel the same with aesthetics. I don't think what has happened in the humanities tells us anything about the arts, and then from that, morality or ethics. I don't believe it at all. I think that's a big problem. I think we need to learn to go back to the arts to understand the negotiation that exists there. Because the reason we're here as a culture, and I'm going to do it again. But if you look at the Renaissance, that's a direct marriage of sort of aesthetics and sort of the rediscovery of Greek mathematics and geometry and all these type of things. Would you say? I'm scared.
No, we
I'm
don't.
scared to
No,
talk
we
about
don't.
anything
Well,
historical.
no. What we recognise now is that what sets off those movements in Europe is the arrival in Europe of the contents of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, right? And there's a story about Andalus and Cordoba and all that sort of stuff. We calling it the Renaissance is already, a bit old-fashioned. What I was going to say about Heidegger, I've lost a
Yeah,
point
go on,
about
Carol. Sorry,
Heidegger.
I just wanted to. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, no. Listen, there's a lot to say about all these guys. Think about Heidegger, right? So one part of his method was to look at the meanings of ancient words. So he'll say, for example, that geometry means land measurement, and hypotenuse originally means the thing that's stretched. So you have the idea of a piece of string being stretched, all that kind of stuff. The thing is, the oldest language he knew about was Greek, which is far too late. By the time the ancient Greeks turn up, the ancient Greeks knew themselves to be a very recent, very young culture. Plato tells a story about Greek philosophers going to Egypt and the Egyptians laughing at them and saying, you Greeks, you'll always be children because you live in an earthquake zone. Whenever you get a bit of culture going, there's an earthquake and you have to start again. Whereas we Egyptians have been here forever. So the Greeks knew themselves to be latecomers. So if you want to do phenomenology that way by looking at the meanings of very old words, you'd have to be looking at something like old Sumerian or something. I mean, the stuff that's written on cuneiform tablets from like 8,000 years earlier. Ancient Greek, by the time you get to the language of the ancient Greeks, we've already left the life world a bit. We've already got some layers of sophistication, and maths is kind of like that. There is, but I'm interested in this stuff about the relationship between body and counting and number. I see Neely's been talking about this again, about the fact that in English the stresses are generally evenly spaced. So actually counting in English, it helps you keep a rhythm, because of the nature of the language. But there's some stuff one of my students is working on is to do with subitizing. Do you know about subitizing?
Never even heard the word.
All right, let me do the subitizing advert. So subitizing is your ability to identify small numerosities by sight. So if there are 4 mugs on your table, you don't need to count them. You can just see that there are 4 at a glance.
I love this. I love this because the same thing exists in music. Because I can reckon certain time signatures, I don't have to count them to work them out. I know
Yeah.
what they are. And a big hero of mine is a guy called Mark Mondesir, who is even more advanced than me at time signatures. And we were chatting about Mahavishnu, and he goes, have you never noticed this? Because that's in we were chatting about celestial terrestrial commuters by the Mahavishnu. It's in 1916 time at about 250 beats per minute. You can't count it because it's traveling so fast. And he turned around and he said, have you noticed when they come out of the solos, they don't play they play 1 bar of 9/8. And I said, how do you know that, Mark? He said, I can just tell. I can just feel it. And so we can, you can. This is the thing that I find interesting about mathematics is I'm dealing with mathematics all the time. And, but I'm dealing it from a visceral level that's more in here. And so that is definitely an aspect of mathematics. And so, and I've always been very interested in the way that you can recognize certain numbers and that you could recognize 4 almost instantaneously, but 7, you do that instant 4 and 3, don't you? It's like when you throw a dice almost and you look at those things.
That ability to recognize small numerosities instantly is called subitizing. I've got a student who's writing a doctorate about how you can teach small children maths better if you let them do it rather than make them count. So the idea is when people have little children, they want them to learn to count. So they go, what can you see? Three ducks. Let's check. One, two, three. And the child, what does the child learn? The child learns that its natural ability to see three ducks at a glance is bad or at best unreliable and needs to be replaced by this counting thing. And this actually holds children back, and that what we need to do is find ways of getting them to engage with number that makes best use of their natural abilities. But yeah, the I think one of the things is, and goes back to what we were saying earlier about reducing things. I don't much care to see anything reduced to anything else. I always worry about the losses. Um, is I think it's almost always, a mug's game trying to find the point in some practice where nature stops and nurture begins. Right? I mean, there are some things that are clearly got a big slice of nurture, like your mate's ability to notice when, what was it, 1916,
1916, yeah.
1916 slips
Yeah. I
into,
mean, I could talk to you and count 19 at the same time
yeah,
quite easily. I could set up a tempo, and then I could click my fingers every 19 beats while still talking to you. And it's these things. And one of the things I've done when I used to do clinics was play lots of different timings on top of each other, and so I'm dealing with numbers all the
yeah,
time. And so
yeah.
I'll be dealing with, like, how do you place five? How does five exist in the same space as four, for example? That's called a quintuplet, and then
Right. All right. Yeah, yeah, I see. Right. So it's
yeah,
yeah. We're still
But
we're
then,
still in music. We haven't gone off to Plato there. Like
no,
we're
no,
still
no.
thinking
But
about rhythm. Right.
as you were talking, I had a thought which I've never had before, and it comes from my experience as a teacher. I decided at some point that within any subject there's intuitive parts and there's counterintuitive parts, and the intuitive parts you don't need to teach. The student will just get that. Now, the way we've evolved is that in terms of learning to speak, we that's intuitive. We all learn to speak, and there's been lots of study of how that happens. But to learn to write, that is not intuitive. So what you have to have then is some evil camp called a school where they are tied to the table and made to do repetitive actions, because the motivation to speak is the thing that's intuitive, not the ability to speak. There is, and so there is a motivation to see and grab, and it comes out to this grasping hand. And there's a certain point in with human beings, I think, where that intuition no longer works. And I think what you're saying about, if you start to reduce maths down, it reduces down to that intuitive part, when actually the meat and potatoes of maths is the counterintuitive part, where you actually have to say, right, I'll get a piece of paper out now and let's work out what the fourth dimension is. Because
I'm not quite. I'm not sure it maps quite that neatly. And going back to what you said earlier about, well, why is the past and the future one two? Why isn't the past
minus one.
minus one? Right. Well, it's because I think it's because Brouwer was trying to find a kind of phenomenological basis for for the natural numbers, because they're the logical basis of the rest of mathematics. But historically, just going back to negative stuff, historically, the intuitive understanding, the most reliable intuitive understanding of negative numbers was debt. Right. If you look in, at this sort of history where the idea of negative numbers enters the literature and people start laboriously explaining to each other how to do it, what it works, and so it's debt. But of course, a money economy is already a pretty sophisticated thing, which makes me think
Well, that
that
also brings in the wider things that money and barter must have had a very big effect on mathematical history anyway,
Oh yeah,
because
yeah,
people
yeah,
would have
yeah.
been going, "Oh, you've had too many of those. How do you know? I don't." you know.
Well. So this is there was accountancy before there was numbers, because what they did is they had this is back to ancient Babylonia, right? They had counters. For each sheep that you were transporting, you would have a counter to go with it. Now, you don't need to have a counting system if you have a token corresponding to each sheep. You just need to watch the sheep go by and pile up the tokens, right? You don't need to have words to go, right? But then, well, that sort of thing develops. But the point is that actually accountancy comes before maths, and that first bit of math is a way of tidying up the accountancy. Do you mind if we I mean, this is all I'm happy to talk about mathematics and number and rhythm and so on.
I mean, for me, I'm, you're probably thinking this is what I do all day long, but I'm having very specific thoughts because I'm going, hang on, I'm a musician, I'm a drummer, and there is actually something to be added to this, and it's quite interesting to see how us musicians think and how it relates to this. And I do think what this has shows there may well be that aesthetic gap within this. This is another area where there's a gap, I think, in the way aesthetics relates to mathematics or whatever you want to call it. I think there's a lot that I'm thinking of, and I'm thinking, well, that's a reality to me.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so
I mean,
so
well, actually, do you know the bit of Kant where it said, "Oh, your views a bit Kant." It's actually called the transcendental aesthetic, right? So, yeah, uh,
I will look into that. Yeah, I just wanted to add. There was something that you also said that I've just found really compelling. When I think of numbers, I picture a picture which I've pictured my whole life and is entirely specific, right down to the typeface of the numbers. The typeface of the numbers is a big felt tip on sugar paper. So obviously, this goes back to me reading those numbers on the wall when I was at school to start. That's how I imagine them, and I imagine numbers coming out of the ground. You've got heaven and earth. This dialectic heaven and earth, and zero is ground level, and the numbers come out of the ground, and then when they get to 10, it goes 10, 11, 12 diagonally, and then it goes off to infinity that way, right? And that's actually dark. And then it
right.
does exactly the opposite the other way underground. And that goes into a sort of different type of dark. It has a color. It's I picture what I'm finding interesting out of this conversation is whether there is any utility in looking at the aesthetic way in which we think of number.
Well, there is, but it tends to be specific to the person. So what you just described is a mental image that kind of fleshes out the abstraction of
Yeah.
number for you. And lots of people, most people, I think, have something like that, but they tend to be personal. And mathematicians, research mathematicians, um, roughly divide themselves into algebraists and geometers. And that isn't necessarily whether they study algebra or geometry, it's more about whether their aesthetic connection with the subject is spatialized or uh, articulated through an aesthetic relationship with the symbols. So if you're kind of you could be doing set theory or algebra or whatever, but if your way of doing that is to imagine things in space, to spatialize it, then you have a geometric soul, even if
Yeah,
even though you're doing algebra, and it can work the other way around as well. So yes, there is a lot to be said and a lot of value, I think, in exploring that. But what you're not going to get is a description of how humans understand maths. What you're going to get is a mass of quite idiosyncratic descriptions of how individuals manage to cope with this abstract stuff. So yeah, that's great territory. But you're not going to get if you're hoping for a general theory or something
No,
reductive
I
or
think
whatever.
you know what I believe. I'll put my cards on the table. I think that human beings are reaching for something, and they're trying to reach for truth and beauty, and those are two different things. But they are actually two halves of one thing, which I could describe as the sublime, and it's that feeling of awe. It's that feeling of wonder. And I think that religious people call that God, scientists call it inspiration, and I think the tying of those two things together, almost impossible most of the time, but that glimpse that you get when you pull those two things together. So I think there's an aesthetic aspect of number. There is a rational, predicting truth and working out, dimensions. There's that aspect of number, which is like science and art, and those are two halves. And when they come together, because so you can imagine a mathematician listening to there's a Bach piece where it's the same tune. So the bass notes are going bong, and then every four beats, and right then there's got another set of going double that, and then another set of double on top of that. And when you listen to it, you cannot believe as it weaves through these harmonic structures that it's the same piece. It's like it's unbelievable, and they could have only arrived at that through some sort of intuitive process. And yes, it's so mathematically dense. And when you come across something like that, it's awe-inspiring. There's a sort of unification, which I just think is good for us to experience. That's my basic point. I think it's what we live for, basically.
Yeah, yeah, I don't disagree. I just,
Yep.
I just, I just prefer if people didn't, reify it or build theories on it. Just, just, just sit in that moment and and
Well,
and and soak it up.
that's what I'm trying to get across is that one you can run into the aesthetic realm and you can go as mad as you possibly like, but you have to say we're in the aesthetic realm now. Now, when you're going to do science, you do not want that, impinging on what you are trying to elucidate. True.
Well. You don't want to say this is true just because you like it,
Yes,
just because it
exactly.
appeals to you.
Yeah.
But there is an aesthetic aspect. So I'm trying to remember now. I wish I'd. I think it was. I think it was Littlewood, a mathematician, said something like, "There's no permanent place for ugly mathematics." Right. There is this idea that the mathematics, the pure mathematics that's worth doing, will have a kind of will show its value by its elegance. And you do get kind of pop versions of this, like actually, here's one for you: is the 10 most elegant equations or the 10 most beautiful equations. And actually, it's not equations that are beautiful; it's proofs, proof ideas. Over here, gestures at bookshelf.
Mm.
There's a book which is a collection of particularly elegant mathematical proofs, and was inspired by a Hungarian mathematician called Erdős, who had this idea of the book of proofs, which you give to God. He didn't believe in God, but he believed in the elegance of proofs, right? So that what you're trying to do is, but of course, all of this happens within the discipline that you've got to you got to satisfy the rules of logic and rigor and so on. You can't and get the elegance as well. That's why people devote their lives to this stuff. We've been going for a while. So if would you
We
mind if
change
we?
tack. Well, I'm enjoying this so much. We'll come back to this because I'll have some. I'll get some more concrete thoughts because my brain is going 10 to the dozen. I'm thinking about what about Indian classical music that does exactly the same thing you just described, and it's a revelation of God's plan, and yet the mathematicians are saying it's not God, but it seems like it's God, and all these type of philosophical conundrums that only art banging against science can ever produce.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, well, different. I mean, different mathematicians have different religions and say different religious things about their maths. Um, but some of them will say things that will be as satisfyingly mystical as any mystic could want.
Yeah.
Um, but they only speak for themselves. There's a thing I wanted to think about. So, like, there are two, because I mean, this all started with me.
Pushing back, yeah. And
Right.
I wanted to, like I said before we started filming, I wanted to talk to you about maths, and you've said more than enough for me to go on my way and have a good think about it. It's been, there's too much there at the moment. And then you asked me something earlier on that I might be able to have a chat about and have a bit more knowledge about, which was this idea. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah. So, I mean, think about, why did I bother to make a video? And there are two reasons really. Two official things that I think I could um, publicly say, yeah, this is what I care about. One of them is to do with philosophy. I mean, I've spent my professional life teaching and doing philosophy, so it's important for me that philosophy should be a serious endeavor, and it shouldn't just be people, you know, thinking of things and saying, well, these two things happened at about the same time, so they must be
You
connected.
like French philosophers do. That's a joke, by the way.
Yes, some of my best friends, mes meilleurs amis are French philosophers, so you be careful.
Yeah.
Um, you can't just. I was looking. I was. I talked about punk. I mean, I think about punk because punk is the first um, cultural movement that I remember living through, so I could compare my memory with the way it's written up.
Yeah.
So I went and had a look. What else happened in 1976? Um, do you know what the really big musical news was in 1976?
I could remember it myself. I can remember Jerry Rafferty went to number one, and that was a big song. You'd got like ABBA, you got like disco was coming in, and on top of that, progressive rock was going mainstream with things like, it wasn't quite there yet, but War of the Worlds, Variations by
Yeah, yeah,
Andrew
yeah, yeah.
By, and I
Yeah,
and,
but the
and so this is where when you pushed against me. I went, he's totally right because I have been trying to explain that the narrative that is in jazz, blues, rock music, and this popular narrative is completely untrue. It's completely untrue.
yeah,
Punk did not destroy progressive rock, and actually, punk grew out of progressive rock.
yeah. Actually, I mean, the guy that wrote the songs for the Sex Pistols was really into Roxy music, wasn't he?
Of
I
course,
saw that.
yeah, yeah,
I saw that in an interview. No, the really big news in 1976. Brotherhood of Man won the Eurovision Song Contest,
that's right.
right?
Yes.
So I started to fantasize about uh, a history of popular music and popular culture, which made a point of sidelining all the stuff that earnest rock journalists and rock intellectuals like,
Mm.
and would maybe concentrate on things like Brotherhood of Man and also, you know, uh, um, novelty records, like have a whole chapter on "Shut Up, Your Face," you
Mm.
know. And then I started to think, and you may not like this next bit, but I started to think I'm going to need some intellectual frame to make this respectable. This is this morning. I thought, of course, what intellectual frame could you wrap around novelty records and one-offs and stuff that the English aesthetic, right? I've started to imagine a history of popular music which really played up daft records and that borrowed and possibly abused your English aesthetic thing in order to give it a kind of structure and shape. I mean, it would be as toe cutty and forced and have as much arbitrariness as any of the other things we've been poking at, but it would be like different. It would give you a different angle. So yeah, so one of the things I care about is that philosophy should be rigorous and it shouldn't just be people
Mm.
remembering things that happened at about the same time and saying, well, they must be connected. There's a game that grad students play, which is I've read everything, have you? Right. And the trick of it is to go, well, I've read when everything, I mean the important stuff. What's the important stuff? It's the stuff I've read. If you can hide that circularity, you win the game. And philosophy, whatever it is, whatever I've been doing all these years, it can't be that. It's got to be something more serious than that. So one of the things I care about. But there's another motivation, which is to do with artistic practice. And I want to ask you about what you think about this.
Mm.
Um, so one of the things that Hegel said is that the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the falling of the dusk, right?
That sounds like
Philosophy.
something you would say.
It is something he wrote. Something he wrote. Philosophy paints its grey on grey in the fading light.
How you doing, Hegel? Well, be honest.
I'm painting.
I can't
I'm
even remember
painting
what you
me.
said.
I'm painting me grey on grey in the fading light. It's all right. But his point is that philosophy, and this came up in your video with John, where you said at some point, I think it was you said at some point, you know, art is generally about 20 years ahead of philosophy. That something will happen in the arts, and then 20 years later, the philosophers will start to write it up. Hegel's point is that philosophy is 20 years behind everything because certainly this kind of
You're just trying to make me agree with Hegel, aren't you? But because I think that is it surely it's the same thing with science as well. Because science is like is immovable. If science discovers something, philosophy can't inform that. It has to then go, well, what are we going to
yeah,
do about this? It's like
yeah,
look at
exactly,
look at
exactly.
the. I mean, if you look at free will and determinism, which are two bedrocks of philosophy, they were shaken by Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum, mechanics. Both of those contradicts
Yeah,
each other.
yeah,
You go, whoa.
yeah, and non-Euclidean geometry, bad news for Kant, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so philosophy comes late in the day. So if you take this zeitgeist stuff seriously, so this is part of my worry about
Mm.
this whole. We're going to think about aesthetics. We're going to think about art and culture by reifying our periodization and saying, well, there is the Renaissance, and that's not just a label of ours. That's really a genuine division in the past, right? Well, what it produces is the idea of the avant-garde. It's the idea that at any given moment there is a zeitgeist, there is a spirit of the age, um, and then vanguardism is the idea that there are some people who know what it is. But Hegel is right in this point, which is that they can't. Like anybody who claims to know what's going on is either is either lying or a charlatan or deluded, or what they're really telling you is that zeitgeist is gone because you can only really understand what the spirit of the age is once it's articulated itself in sufficient detail and in enough different forms for you to be able to identify it philosophically. And the reason this bothers me, and this actually does tie in with my own kind of musical autobiography, is I can imagine a student coming to you, art student, music student, creative writing student. How are you getting on? Oh, well, I've got lots of ideas. I'm working on them. I'm producing stuff. I'm quite pleased with the stuff I'm producing. The trouble is, though, I went to your lecture and I understood that in every age there's a spirit. And I got the impression that you're not really producing art of any worth unless your art engages with the spirit of the age and somehow crystallizes or critiques or somehow comments on it. And I don't know what the spirit of the age is. So although I'm quite satisfied with the creative work I'm doing in myself, I'm worried that I'm not engaging with the zeitgeist because your way of talking about culture persuaded me that that's what I need to do. Right? And of course, what you would say to this person is, do your own, like, forget about my lecture, do your own thing. But you see what the difficulty is, what the worry is.
Yeah, and it's a thought I've been having quite recently is that when I started looking really deeply into the history of jazz, the one thing that nobody said was the fact that recording by the original Dixieland jazz band, the white jazz group who said that they created jazz and it opens, and then our modern identity politic comes along and goes, that's so bad, and what about this person? And then people start to go looking, like you say, looking for the proof rather than just seeing what's there. The one thing that never gets said is it sold 1 million records, and that they didn't expect it to sell 1 million records. It was a novelty record. And then you start to realize that every single artistic avant-garde breakthrough, if you want to call it that, starts out as a novelty, and it catches on because people, it's novel. And if you think, if rather than the word avant-garde, which is French and very, the word novel, oh, that's quite novel, isn't it? Oh, you've got your trousers on the wrong way around, that's quite novel, isn't it? That idea of novelty. And so I now understand your bringing in of the English aesthetic in novelty songs, because it's a lot, that's a lot deeper than I thought. Now I've got there. So jazz emerges, and it's popular, and this novelty, people come along that come from a different place. They're not like Louis Armstrong. He comes from a different place. He's not part of the establishment or the academy. And he goes, I can make novelty records, you wait. And he's a genius at it. And then it lays the groundwork, and all this is being driven by popularity. Now, I don't want to get into capitalism, and because of course the companies come in and go, yeah, we can make money out of it. That's all true as well. But what I would like to rather focus on is the novelty aspect, the fact that people love it. And they go, this is great, isn't it? And then people go, I think it's a bit callous to go, oh, then people come in and just then copy it because they want to make money. People copy it because they love it. That's what we all do. And if you look all the way through history, when rock and roll emerges, it's the same type of thing. It's all very novel. And I was chatting to, the thing that made me realise this, I was chatting to my friend Kevin Gammond, who played with Jimmy Cliff in the mid-60s in London. And then he formed the band of Joy with Robert Plant. And he was telling me about gigs that Alexis Korner were doing, and all these people that created rock and roll, we were all really reverent. He said they would go into gigs and they would be like a children's party, and there would be like 30 kids there, and they'd be up there playing Muddy Waters tracks. He says it was all so naive and novel. And I think this idea that things start as a novelty, they then get studied, and it gets replicated really, really well. And then once you get to that point, there's another process that comes in, which is, I think, the sort of intelligentsia scoring sort of points by going, well, if we go back to before the novelty, you'll see there was somebody there that thought this up. And that's probably the case, because every single idea in the arts, I don't think comes from the person who's credited. It's not like science. That's like somebody discovers it, they tell everybody, and I'm sure.
Yeah, there's always intimations. There's always forerunners. There's always.
But the person who is sat there, the genius that is sat there that doesn't have any success, if the novelty hadn't come along and made it a success, they would be a failure. They're as much as a failure as every other avant-garde artist. Now, if we throw into this the genius of Marcel Duchamp, because I did my degree in fine art, and I decided that the greatest piece of art in the 20th century is that urinal.
Right.
And he was pretty left wing, and he believed that art should be for the people. It should be novelty stuff. It should be fun and entertainment, and still has this big aesthetic kick and value. But to do that, he would have to tie up the art intelligentsia into a knot. And when you study that Marcel Duchamp urinal, it's so multi-layered. We don't even know if it existed. Getting past all the conceptual things, where is this art or is it not art? We don't know whether it existed. We don't know whether he made it. So quite recently, the Identity Brigade came along and they went, Marcel Duchamp never created that. It was made by a woman, and she got ignored because she was a woman. And I thought, can't you see the magic of this artist still having the ability to get in there and dumbfound that intelligentsia who are, again, there's something about art where I think there is there's a value to it socially where there's a certain group of people, and all art forms, for it to be like that, it has to die. The art form has to be closed down so that they can go, you're not doing it correctly, it has to be done like this. And I think that process, to counter what you said earlier, there's one little thought I had. It could well be that process is getting faster because of communication being quicker, and so that when we do look at cultural epochs, that's maybe why they're speeding up. But yes, I think that you are correct in this could undermine the whole history of art. Because we're not focusing on the novelties because we don't think they're clever enough. So the real art that's going on is YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, computer games. That's where art, I know this. That is where art is at the moment.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, old lads like us aren't going to make it. It's going to be people who don't care about any of the things that we've been discussing. That's
Well, I studied art. I've got a degree in art, and it's funny that I left all that behind. I was going to be a painter, and I left all that behind, and I became a drummer. And then my whole life up until now has been doing music. And then I go towards YouTube because music's just supposed to. You see that as an add-on to your music career, and then suddenly it switched round. And one of the things I became aware of is the framework in which YouTube works. And my art training was like, this can actually be stressed. And I've continually done it, from very serious discussions with the people like you about the fundamentals of philosophy on a music channel. And this will get people saying, you should stick to music. Why are you talking about philosophy? And I saw in the comments this morning, some guy said, yeah, but music is linked to philosophy. Let Andy do what he's doing. I was thinking, oh my God, this is amazing that conversation is going on. And so, yeah, I have pushed at the edges of this format here. I've pushed at the edges of it. Now, one of the ideas I've had to push at the edges of this type of thing is to actually get actors and have fake discussions. So when somebody comes along to my channel, they don't know whether this is real or not. Undermining. There's a part of me that wants to undermine the truth as much as elucidate it. I don't know why, and I think it's an aesthetic thing. That's why I like your idea of this alternative history of music that, you know, looks at Remember You're a Womble as the great track of the early 70s, you know, which influenced the career of ELO, you know, and because I know the guys out of ELO, and I keep having this joke. I confuse Remember Their Womble. I go, oh, that's by ELO, isn't it?
yeah. But this would only be a footnote. This would only be a footnote, right? The influence of Remember You're a Womble on ELO.
Yeah.
Most of the chapter would be about
the what? Because in a way, ELO are good, but they haven't got their own TV series and live underground, overground, wombling free. I mean, there's a whole world there, the wombling world.
There is. No, listen.
Consumerism and waste, and they were ahead of their time in terms of looking at environmentalism.
The chapter on the English in the book about the English aesthetic, about the way the Wurzels foresaw what those lads in waistcoats called. I can't remember the name of the band.
Oh, Mumford & Sons. But who would you rather listen to?
Oh, come on.
It's the Wurzels every time, isn't it? The Wurzels every time. Oh, you know, I've got to be honest. I did a video on Chaz and Dave. I think Chaz and Dave are heavyweight. I really do. I think their solution to making British rock and roll is as clever as King Crimson. They're musically brilliant players, and then some of their songs are very touching and moving. And when you listen to the grooves on there, this isn't English music. It's American music. It's a brilliant combination, and but we're getting into. Are we not getting a bit postmodern here? Are we not getting a bit Roland Barthes and
Well, look, I
focusing
mean,
on this?
one of the things that I've always thought about postmodernism is most of the ideas that are associated with it, far from being dangerous, are actually rather banal and sensible, and as old as the hills. Right. So, I mean, John mentioned Tristram Shandy. I'd already written Tristram Shandy down before he mentioned it. But, that whole business about playing with the medium as if this was something new. Don Quixote, right? Don Quixote was published in two volumes. And in volume two, we meet people who've read volume one. Right, so already in 1612, it says here that as soon as somebody creates a new form, the first thing that happens is so all that stuff, we're breaking the fourth wall, ceci n'est pas une pipe. Like, come on, I mean it's fun and you should do it, but don't tell me that it started in the 60s, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's in Greek tragedy, isn't it? You've got the chorus which comments on, which jolts the viewer continually the
Yeah, all that stuff.
realization that they're
So,
watching.
so,
Yeah,
so I just think like there's this kind of rational core of postmodernism that is actually just sort of sensible self-awareness, and the only way it goes wrong is if you get too excited about it and think that it means the end of civilization or something. Talking about Chaz and Dave, do you have a view about chap hop? I mean,
about what?
chap hop, people like Mr. B, the Gentleman Rhymer, and Professor Elemental, people like that. Do you
I
know
don't know
them?
who you're talking about now.
Oh, right. Oh, well, let me introduce you. So these are um, British hip hop enthusiasts who love their hip hop and wanted to participate, but they were smart enough to realize that if you are a middle class English person, you can't just put on a baseball cap and a bad accent. You have to do something. You have to kind of um, so in different ways, what they did was to lean into their Englishness. So Professor Elemental does this. He wears a pith helmet and does this steampunk thing, and has yeah. So he goes, but Mr. B, the Gentleman Rhymer, does
He
a kind
sounds
of
like my type of guy. This does.
yeah. So Mr. B, the Gentleman Rhymer, does this kind of George Formby thing. He plays a banjo
Yeah.
but with hip hop. Um, and they're I mean, exactly how good they are is up to you to decide when you look at them. But again, it's that Chas and Dave thing where you think I'm a big fan of this American music form. I want to participate, but I can't just like pretend to be American. You've got to do something with who you are.
In my
And permission to do that is part of your thing about who owns the music, isn't it?
That exactly when I was making rap records I was part of the UK garage scene and I made rap records, and then the group I was in had a huge hit record with a house track called Strings of Life Soul Central. Stronger on My Own. It went top 10 in about 10 countries. It was huge. I wasn't involved in that because that's my sort of luck that I've had in the music industry. When we were doing this, I got a call from a guy, and the record companies had gone nuts over this Birmingham-based rap group. They were all trying to get. It's like the industry knew something was going on, and that group was the Streets. And a management company I was working with, I got hooked up with the two rappers. They grabbed the two rappers in the Streets because they were sort of breaking apart. And then Mike Skinner, who was the producer, he was stuck on his own, and the only thing he could do was rap himself, which actually worked better because he wasn't a virtuoso rapper like these guys that I was working with. But when I met up with them, they were doing this sort of English rapping hip hop thing, with sort of their Birmingham accents and London accents. And I said, "Where did you get this from?" And they said, I said, I gotta be honest, we were sat there watching the chart show on a Saturday morning, and Park Life came on by Blur, and we went, oh my God, this is British rap. And he said, we actually waited for their next single to come out, which was Girls and Boys, and went, oh, they're mad. They've invented. And so this idea, now, when I thought about this, I thought, well, where's Blur got this from? And Blur's got it from Ian Jury. Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick, one of the greatest
Mhm,
records ever
mhm.
made. And so you start to see that, and that Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick is not quite a novelty, but we're now getting into that thing. Now, when I looked at rap and hip hop, I found out that in the early 60s, Muhammad Ali, they decided to put his speeches to beats in about 1963, and they got some cool to get it, and that really is a rap record. Again, all this goes back to novelty, and so this idea that of the English aesthetic taking American culture as we do, uh, that has been the history of popular music. And there's, I mean, even now you got Ed Sheeran and Adele are still, and Coldplay, three of the biggest artists in the world. And it's that collision of the American pop music aesthetic with, the English aesthetic. It's a very, very powerful thing. But this idea that it goes back to novelty, because it's the Laughing Policeman, isn't it? It's musical. It's entertaining the masses with something of that ilk could well be the avant-garde source of so much that we value.
Well, one thing about a lot of that stuff is it respects people's intelligence because it trusts you to know that this is a joke, and that may be quite important as far as how we think about popular culture. Because I mean, I haven't done a lot of philosophy of music. I looked at analytic philosophy of music and ran away in despair because
It's
it didn't.
rubbish. I just there's a couple of areas that I despair at. One is the philosophy of aesthetics, especially when related to music, and when somebody does do a study, my gut feeling is that they haven't got a clue what they're doing. Oh, let's get some children to put some bark on headphones and see if they can do maths better. All these type of things, which doesn't get to the raw visceral power of what music is. That's the one thing, and the other one is not considering what cognitive science can tell us about education. I mean, this is one of the most obvious ones, but why are we not looking at cognitive science and trying to line our education systems up? Those are my two bugbears. But yes, I don't know the world is.
I would be happy to come back and talk about education because like you, I've worked in it for over 30 years and have things to say.
I got
Um,
ejected from it a couple of years ago for things I can't quite discuss.
okay.
And I don't. Yeah, I won't say any more about
I'm
it.
still employed.
Yes, I know. I saw. I checked you out.
Any of your geriatric viewers have grandchildren thinking of applying to university, don't overlook the smaller departments.
Because you need the money. We need the students. We promise you the degree before you even start. Just
Oh
come
no, no,
on
oh
in.
no, 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 no. We don't do that. We do not do that. Um,
It does happen though, doesn't it?
well,
Look, this is brilliant. Come on, you're a
the way
philosopher.
I
You
tell
have
you
a
what,
respect for truth.
the way it's fudged is the distinction between a pass and a good degree. So in official statistics, what counts as a good degree, what's recorded as so we when we analyze by gender and ethnicity and so on, we look at who's getting a good degree and so on. And a good degree is a first or a 2-1. But the pass mark is is a third, right? So we're not going to guarantee you a good degree by any means. You've got to turn up and do the work and be good at it to get one of those. Um, we're not going to guarantee you that you get a pass mark either. You do actually have to turn up and do something.
let's save this for another discussion because
Yeah.
are I know exactly where you're going with it, and I almost thought this guy's working in university because I'm really exploring the idea of education, not to try and pull it all down, but I think there is so much hovering over education that's going to change it, and I think the universities, if they are going to survive, need to drastically change what they're doing. And I also have ideas about the amount of people. I mean, basically, I think the government should fund the universities. There should be less places. It should be a little bit more elitist, and you should be grabbing, in your department, the very best brains and training those up. And in a postmodern world, where we're not supposed to be elitist, it creates a real problem for education where you are trying to dish out a certificate that measures elitism.
Let's do that another day.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Where,
because I'm out of it now, I'm like a bull in a china shop. I'm ready
yeah,
to,
yeah,
say.
yeah.
But
Well, what I was going to say is, so I was just, I just sort of despair of analytic philosophy of music. A lot of it just seems to be philosophy of mind by other means. So I ran away from that and I bought Adorno's essays on music, and I read his essay on jazz, and I thought, well, this is a load of racist nonsense. Um, I can't remember I can't remember why I set off on that, but
well, a fan of the channel and a very valuable contributor every now and then is Ben Watson, who used to write for uh, Wire magazine and wrote Negative Dialectics of Poodle Play. Frank Zappa. He's a huge Adorno fan, and as much as I don't agree with him, he's been lovely to come on the channel, and we've had some really good conversations. And I do think some of the stuff he's offering about Adorno, and I think he'd be a good guy to bring on as well to talk about whether that essay is racist. So I think he would say it's just Adorno. He's talking about something slightly different by the word jazz to what we, to what I'm arguing for Adorno now, but
yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look at the dates, it's not like it's not like he's listened to Kind of Blue and thought,
nah, no,
right. So
he's looking at the spread of jazz across the world, which is something that never gets discussed. And this brings us to ownership, which is something I wanted to ask you about, and I think that can be the final discussion.
sure.
That with this idea of the novelty record, this idea that all these great art forms started in places where this stuff wasn't valued, where people were just having fun. It was usually created by people around about 20 years old, having parties, having a good time, and they come up with something and it catches on and everyone thinks it's great. All of that stuff. And then 100 years later, people are coming along and going, well, this was created by this noble group or this noble group, and they had this to say about the world, and they add in something which actually isn't there, or they forget it is there. It is there. The worth obviously is there aesthetically, or we wouldn't be, feeling as we do about it so many years later. If I put early jazz on, I'm astonished. Jelly Roll Morton or Louis Armstrong, those two especially. I'm astonished at what's going on. You just go, oh my God, this is just absolutely groundbreaking. So I take that one back. But the context in which that was created, the ownership of it, I think, is a bit fake for the intelligentsia or whatever, that elite, or whatever you want to say. Look, this is ours, and we're gonna control who can speak about it, play it. You can play it, but only if you respect it. That's the thing. You could talk about it, but only if you doff your cap and respect it, which I don't think was the way the thing was when they were doing it. I don't think there was any respect for anything at the beginnings of these things in the arts.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things is that it's very rare for any community to be so isolated that it's not had any. I mean, possibly um, old style Appalachian music. Maybe that really did live
Oh
up in the
wait, no,
mountains.
because of the roots of it. There was nobody there. It's relatively new form of music, and it gets formed completely out of people coming to that country, and they
Right? No, no, no. But I
nobody could
mean,
arrive. Unless they were like brought specially across on the boat and not allowed. And then if they were, it would just be Irish music, and that's all it
Yeah,
would be. And
yeah,
it's not.
fine, great. I mean, so it's all like that, isn't
It's
it?
all like that. Yes, it's
It's
all like
all like
that.
that. I mean, one of my favorite CDs, it was something we bought in the States. It's called Before the Blues, and it's my favorite stuff because it's just great music. Um, there was a period all I wanted to be was a Mississippi mud stepper because there was a band called the Mississippi Mud Steppers that made this fantastic sound. But that's the story about like the blues isn't this thing that descended or was emerged out of a rock or something magical. No, there was all sorts of people traipsing about America, and there are reasons why this thing condenses for a while. But the idea that you have some pure cultural form that belongs to just one community. The history,
Just
the history. The thing is,
can't be.
you don't need to do anything terribly political or postmodern. You just need to track the facts, right?
And
You
the
just
thing
need.
is, when you push back against me, that's why I enjoyed it. I thought he's explaining something that I didn't explain well enough, so came across badly. Here's a thought. They invent recording around about 1870, right? What's the first thing they record? It's not even music. It's talking. You can see the sort of Western view. Let's record some Shakespeare. It's a nursery rhyme, then Shakespeare. Then what should we do? Classical music, blah blah blah, by 1900 they're selling millions of records, and that's like 30 years later. Caruso's selling millions of records, and nobody's thought to record jazz or blues. That gets to 1920, 50 years, and then they record it, and lo and behold, it just takes over. And at that point, the world goes, what the hell was this? And they don't know because nobody was tracking it down. When you study the early history of jazz, you're looking at tiny little things in the newspaper in 1895 that mentions a jazz group playing at some fete. And we're basing all this. Oh my God, they were playing there, and the mythicism, the mythicalness. Neither of those are any good.
Yeah, the myth making. Yeah,
That surrounds, Buddy Bolden and all these early jazz musicians, is we just don't know what it is. And what happens is that intelligentsia like John Hammond and Alan Lomax, they then arrive in the 1930s, and it's not until the 1930s they even decide that this is worth looking at. And so they go around all the prisons and they find people, they find Leadbelly, and in jazz, they find Bunk Johnson. But what these guys do is give them what they want. They give them what they want. And so I have not been able to say this, but I'm going to say it here because it's going to be buried right at the end of this video and no one will see it that matters. I think that when the original Dixieland Jazz Band had that hit, whatever they were doing, whether it's rooted in black music, which it was, or minstrelsy, or Creole music, whatever it was rooted in, the way they were doing it, everyone else would have gone, let's just do it like that because you sell loads of records. The same as when that local music record label rang up a record shop and said, we need some more of this blues. And they went, well, there's a bloke outside this shop singing. I think it's John Lemon Jefferson or something. They grabbed him. Now, that guy was a busker. He would have been playing every type of music going. And they we want this blues, we want this, no. And they put on an act. It's the biggest fake there is. It's incredible music. It's wonderful because these people are coming up with novelties. It's like, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can have two electric guitars together, or maybe I can play like a ragtime on this 12-string guitar. There's all this is happening, but what they're doing is creating something new, and yet we want to look at it as some sort of esoteric truth about American history that has all these ramifications that will add up to the way we want to see the world now, in terms of our sort of, the America did this great crime against, black people, and then all these things that are wound into it, which is true, but was not perceived like that by black people at the time. There's a different view. I've really gone so deep into this one that I'm confident enough to say this, And I think it happens in every single music form eventually. It's happened.
I think something like that's got to be right. I mean, I've read a bit of, the history of the blues, and they have to go to prisons because it's prisoners that you can instruct to play. The other great thing about prisoners is they aren't going to juke joints and listening to big band jazz on records. So you can convince yourself that they're a bit less corrupted.
Have you
But
heard
of
the
course,
story about Alan Lomax when he
yeah. This is the Alan Lomax stuff I have in mind about
yeah,
this.
he like that idea when he crept up to the black bar. Have you ever heard that story? So he was siding with one Robert Johnson, couldn't get him, got big Bill Brunsey. They're trying to collect all
Yeah.
these sort of urban Delta blues peoples. And one day he decides to creep up to this bar down south, and he goes up and he listens to what they're listening to, and it was Fats Waller. And he was upset because Fats Waller, and the thing about Fats Waller, he's a musical genius. It's brilliant. It's future music. It really is truly avant-garde. And yet the intelligentsia don't want to look at that. They always want to go to this idea of the authentic. They always want to show that there's this, and in a way, I find it racist in a way to go. It's like the noble. It's like Rousseau's like this noble savage idea that these people have this, and they're not. They're brilliant musicians that were pulling from classical, and working together. Because musicians, however prejudiced they might be, they will always work together if the music's good. It transcends prejudice. Music does, absolutely does. And I'm
For as
seeing,
long
yeah.
for as long as you're playing it, right? For as long as they're working together, making that great sound.
Well, I'll give you an example. When I started working with Punch Records, and I was going around schools doing rap workshops, and I got put in with about three black rappers that had grown up in Birmingham, and here I'm a middle class kid growing up in the sort of semi-rural Kidderminster. And so I turn up at this first school, and I'm doing the production, and we do the thing, and I work with these guys, and we're all nice and everything, and then we go off to dinner time, and I was nervous because I was thinking they're cool rap guys, they're all black and they're cool, and I'm not cool, and they can do all this, and I felt I was aware of their otherness. So we sit down, and the one guy turns around and he cracks a joke. He goes, "Oh my God, that's like Mr. Ben." And then the other guy goes, "Yeah, do you remember Mr. Ben? Oh, I used to love Mr. Ben." And I've suddenly found my going, "Oh God, do you remember the episode?" And then suddenly we were together because the music had brought us together, and then we recognised our similarities more than our differences. And I've got a lot of stories about that time, and seeing my own prejudices and seeing how they worked. But nowadays, I find that we've gone the other way around now, and we're supposed to focus on that difference. And if we don't focus on that difference, we're somehow not respecting some sort of thing. I'm not-
Well, I don't know. I guess the question you'd want to ask is whether that kind of whether the kind of people's cultures flowing into each other and understanding each other as musicians and then recognizing each other as whether that's happening in the live bit of culture that we two are too old.
So yeah,
I listen,
it is.
talking to undergraduate age, students. I'm fairly confident that whatever it is they're doing, and I'm even going to try to understand it, whatever it is they're doing, I'm fairly confident that um it's got plenty of the kind of good stuff you were just describing.
I agree, and one of the things of sort of
The thing that guides me through education, that the basic rule is the kids are all right.
I
You
agree.
know?
I agree 100%. When I was teaching colleges, you're in this sort of politically correct framework. I know the things I'm not going to talk about, and I know the things I am going to talk about. I know the areas I'm not going to get into. And so I would go into the class, and these 16-year-old kids would know that this is the thing. And so they would go, "What do you think about Andrew Tate?" And I go, "Well, I haven't got an opinion about Andrew Tate. Have you watched him?" And I don't even want to say whether I've watched him or not to these kids. And the kids were pushing, like kids should, pushing the button pushing the button, you know. And I used to enjoy it. I used to enjoy the way they were taking the culture that they just emerged in and questioning it. And the mainstream narrative is seeing them all in a certain way, and they've all got the same ideas, and there they are, you know, on the campuses, you know, protesting against, you know, Israel and all that type of stuff. But I think in reality, people are people, and the young people they do have the new ideas, don't they? There's no two ways about it.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
really do, don't they?
yeah.
And I think with that, we probably got to a profound truth, which is very simple. After all this discussion, that we can enjoy a good talk about all this, and I really have enjoyed this. It's been a wonderful chat, really covered it. But in the end, we're just having a bit of fun as we approach death, and the kids are there, and the new ideas will come in. So let's just have some faith in those kids. Come on, kids, solve the problems for us, because we can't do it anymore. Do you think that's about right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll
Good.
sign up to that.
I'm glad it's very rare on my channel. I praise the kids. I just usually act the grumpy old middle-aged man and hate everything that's new. So been brilliant talking to you. Shall we finish up there, and we'll make this a and I, and I
Yeah,
and I'm thinking now I've got a few philosophers under my arms. I might do a couple of group chats and get a little philosophical circle going.
sure, sure. Be great.
Not the
Yeah.
Vienna circle, it'd be like the Kidderminster circle.
Roundabout.
Yeah, that's exactly what it'll be. Thank you for sharing. So bye to them all. Bye bye.
Okay. Cheerio, Andy's people.